The Hurtgen forest didn't care about doctrine, and by mid-January of 1945, Corporal James Hutchins had learned that the hard way. He crouched in frozen mud, 200 meters behind what the officers optimistically called the front line, though everyone knew the front was wherever the Germans decided to open fire that morning. His mortar crew, just 3 men and one 81mm tube, had been in this god-forsaken forest since September, and every single day felt like the last one he'd ever see. James had grown up in Flint, Michigan, working summers at his father's hardware store, learning to measure twice and cut once. He'd enlisted 2 days after Pearl Harbor, confident that his steady hands and sharp mind would serve him well. The Army agreed, sending him to Fort Benning for mortar training. 12 weeks later, he could break down and reassemble an M1 mortar blindfolded. He understood trajectories, wind drift, propellant charges. He knew his weapon like some men knew their wives, but knowing your weapon meant nothing when you couldn't see your target. Private First Class Eddie Carmichael, a farm kid from Iowa with hands like oak roots, knelt beside the ammunition crates. He'd been with James since Normandy, never complained, never questioned orders. Next to him sat Private Leon Weiss, a Brooklyn native who'd worked as a jeweler before the war and brought that same precision to his role as assistant gunner. These were good men, reliable men, the kind you wanted beside you when everything went wrong. And this morning, everything had gone wrong. Captain Douglas Osborne's voice crackled over the radio at 6:48. Tight with the kind of controlled panic that came from watching your men die in real time. Hutchins, this is Osborne. Company K is pinned in the clearing east of our position. 3 German machine gun nests on the ridge. They're tearing us apart. I need you to silence those guns. James pressed the handset to his ear, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Sir, I need a forward observer. We don't have line of sight from here. Your forward observer is dead, Corporal. Radio shattered by the same burst that killed him. You're all I've got. The words hung in the frozen air like a death sentence. Forward observers were essential to mortar operations. They watched where your rounds landed, called corrections, guided you onto target. Without one, you were firing blind into a forest so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. The spruce and fir trees rose 20 meters high, their canopy so thick it felt like fighting in perpetual twilight. Sir, I can't see the target from my position. The trees, the ridgeline. I know what you can't see, Hutchins. I'm asking what you can do. Osborne's voice dropped lower. I've got 14 men trapped in that clearing right now. The Germans have them pre-registered. Every time someone moves, they get cut down. Private Raymond Kowalski tried to crawl back. Made it maybe 11 meters before they got him across the shoulders. He's still breathing, but not for long if those guns keep firing. James closed his eyes. He'd shared cigarettes with Kowalski just yesterday. Listened to him talk about his girl back in Cleveland, how they were going to get married as soon as this was over. Artillery? James asked, though he already knew the answer. Committed to counter battery 6 kilometers north. Won't be available for at least 2 hours. Heavy mortars took a hit this morning. 2 tubes destroyed. You're it, Corporal. You and that single tube. Through the trees, James could hear them. The MG-42s, Hitler's buzzsaw, they called them. That distinctive sound like canvas ripping. 1,200 rounds per minute. 20 rounds every second. The Germans could change barrels in 6 seconds, keep firing almost indefinitely. 3 guns working in coordination, interlocking fields of fire across a killing zone that Company K had to cross to reach their objective. How many rounds do you have? Osborne asked. James glanced at Carmichael, who held up 3 fingers. 3 high-explosive rounds, sir. That's all we've got left until resupply. The pause on the other end lasted 3 heartbeats too long. 3 rounds. No forward observer. No line of sight. Osborne's voice carried the weight of a man making an impossible calculation. Can you do it? James looked at his mortar crew. Eddie met his eyes, steady as always. Leon's jaw was tight, but he nodded once. These men trusted him. Company K trusted him. 14 lives hung on his answer. The smart response was no. The honest response was no. Standard doctrine said this mission was impossible. Every manual, every training exercise, every principle of indirect fire demanded an observer, demanded corrections, demanded time. James had none of those things. Give me the coordinates of the clearing, he said quietly. And pray I remember my geometry. As Osborne relayed the information, James stepped away from the mortar and stared through the trees. Somewhere beyond his sight, beyond the ridge, 3 German gun crews were methodically murdering his friends. And somewhere in his memory, buried under 6 months of combat and exhaustion, was a reconnaissance patrol from 3 days ago. A patrol that had cost 2 men and gained nothing but a glimpse of those German positions. He remembered looking at the enemy ridgeline, remembered the angle, the distance, the bearing, and he remembered something else. Something no manual had ever taught him. The church tower in Kleinhau, broken and battered but still standing, rose behind him. 22 meters of shattered stone that marked a point on his map and in his mind. If the tower was behind him and the target was in front of him, then geometry said they were on opposite sides of a straight line. A line that ran directly through where he stood right now. "Sir," James said into the radio, his voice steady despite the ice forming in his veins. "I'm going to need you to trust me. And I'm going to need absolute silence from your position. I have to hear the impacts. You're really going to try this?" "I don't have a choice, sir." Neither do those men in the clearing. As James ended the transmission, Eddie moved closer. "What's the plan, Corporal?" James looked at the church tower behind them, then at the mortar tube, then back at his crew. "We're going to aim backward." Leon's eyes widened. "Backward? James, there's no procedure for..." "I know." James's voice was quiet but firm. "That's why it might just work. Retry." Leon Weiss stared at James like he'd just announced they were going to sprout wings and fly over the German lines. "Backward," he repeated, his Brooklyn accent thickening with disbelief. "You want to aim the mortar at the church tower behind us and somehow hit Germans in front of us?" James knelt beside the mortar tube, his gloved fingers tracing the traversing mechanism. "Not at the tower. Using the tower. It's called a reciprocal bearing. If I know where the tower is relative to my position, and I know where the Germans were 3 days ago relative to that same position, I can calculate the reverse azimuth." Eddie Carmichael tilted his head, processing. Farm kids understood geometry. You learned it planting crops in straight lines, calculating acres, measuring irrigation. Like when you're plowing a field and you line up on a barn behind you to keep your rows straight in the opposite direction. Exactly like that. James pulled out his compass, then his map, spreading it across his knee despite the cold making his fingers stiff. "Except instead of plowing, we're dropping 6.8-pound high-explosive rounds on machine gun nests we can't see." "And if you're wrong?" Leon asked. The question wasn't a challenge, it was genuine fear. "If you calculate wrong, those rounds could land on Company K, on Kowalski." James looked up, meeting Leon's eyes. "If I do nothing, Kowalski dies anyway." "They all do." The sound of the German machine guns echoed through the forest, that terrible ripping sound that never stopped, never paused. James had heard men scream for their mothers, for medics, for God himself, but nothing haunted him like that sound. It was industrial, mechanical, efficient. It turned human beings into statistics. 3 days ago, James said, speaking slowly as he worked through the memory, I was on that reconnaissance patrol with Lieutenant Morrison and Private Davis. We pushed east, got within 800 meters of that ridgeline. Maybe 900? Morrison wanted exact coordinates for artillery. Morrison's dead, Eddie said quietly. Davis too. I know. James's jaw tightened. But before they died, I got a good look at those German positions. And when I looked at them, the Kleinhau church tower was directly behind me. I remember because Morrison made a joke about it. Said something about how even God couldn't watch our backs in this forest. He traced a line on his map from their current position to the tower, then extended it in the opposite direction. If the tower is at bearing 090, the reciprocal is 270. A compass has 360 degrees. Rotate 180 and you're pointing at the exact opposite horizon. Leon crouched beside him, studying the map. Before the war, he'd made engagement rings in his father's jewelry shop, working with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. He understood precision. But James, mortars don't work on compass bearings alone. You need elevation, deflection, charge settings. And you're talking about high-angle fire, nearly vertical. The dispersion on that is massive. I know the dispersion. James's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he made calculations in the margin of his map. At 83 degrees elevation, the round climbs almost straight up, peaks at high altitude, then drops nearly vertical. Time of flight increases to about 50 seconds, but it's the only way to hit a reverse slope target without line of sight. Eddie checked the ammunition. We've got 3 rounds. High explosive, charge 5. That's maximum range, over 2,000 meters. The Germans aren't 2,000 meters away, Leon protested. They're 8, maybe 900. I know. James looked at his crew, and for a moment the mask of confidence slipped. They saw what he was really feeling. Terror mixed with desperate determination. But with high-angle fire, the round goes up before it goes out. The charge gets us the altitude. The elevation gets us the distance. And the deflection, he paused, recalculating. The deflection is where I'm gambling everything. A burst of machine gun fire echoed through the forest, followed by someone screaming. The sound cut off abruptly. James stood, moving to the mortar tube. I'm setting deflection by sighting on the church tower, then rotating the traversing mechanism 3,200 miles. That's 180 degrees, the exact opposite direction. His fingers worked the mechanism with practiced precision, making micro-adjustments. Elevation to 4,700 mils. 83 degrees above horizontal, high enough to clear the ridge and drop almost vertically on the reverse slope. Almost vertically, Leon repeated. James, at that angle, if you're off by even 50 meters, then we adjust for the second shot. James made one more correction. A slight offset left based on what he remembered of the terrain. The German positions were slightly left of the pure reciprocal bearing. Maybe 30 meters. I'm adding 32 mils left. Eddie stood beside the ammunition, his face pale but determined. It's guesswork. It's educated guesswork, James corrected. I've fired this weapon 460 times since Normandy. I know how wind affects trajectory. I know cold propellant burns slower, reduces range by up to 8%. I know this forest, this terrain, this weapon. He looked at both of them. I know what I'm doing. Do you? Leon's voice was barely a whisper. James met his eyes. No, but I'm the best chance those men have, and that has to be enough. He tapped Eddie on the shoulder. Prepare the first round. Charge 5 high explosive. When I give the signal, we fire. Eddie's hands were steady as he prepared the projectile, checking the propellant charge, ensuring the fuse was set correctly. Leon positioned himself by the bipod, one hand on the traversing knob, ready to make adjustments if James called for them. Through the trees, they heard Captain Osborne's voice on the radio again, this time addressing Company K. All positions, hold fire. Mortar mission inbound. Stay down and stay quiet. The German guns continued their methodical work. But now James could hear other sounds between the bursts, men breathing hard. Someone praying, the wet sound of blood on frozen ground. Range to target, James muttered. Running through the calculations one final time. 850 meters approximate. Wind from the northwest at maybe 8 knots. Temperature minus 4 degrees Celsius. Propellant cold, reduces velocity by 7%. Trees will disrupt wind patterns, create unpredictable drift. He shook his head. Too many variables. Can't account for all of them. So how do you compensate? Eddie asked. James smiled, but there was no humor in it. I don't. I fire, I listen, and I pray that 6 months of experience counts for something. He checked the tube one final time, verifying the deflection, the elevation, the sight picture. Everything was as perfect as he could make it. Everything except the fundamental problem. He was aiming at targets he couldn't see, using a technique that didn't exist in any manual, betting 14 lives on geometry and memory. Ready? He asked quietly. Eddie held the first round, positioned over the tube. Leon's hand was on the traversing knob. Both men nodded. James took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. Somewhere in that clearing, Raymond Kowalski was bleeding out. Somewhere on that ridge, 3 German gun crews were doing their job with ruthless efficiency. And somewhere between those 2 points, a mortar round was about to trace a mathematical arc. Part 5. The weight of success. The German counterattack came at 1400 hours, 2 in the afternoon, just as Captain Osborne had predicted. It wasn't a full assault, just probing attacks designed to test American positions and identify weak points. James and his crew spent the afternoon moving between firing positions, dropping rounds on coordinates called in by forward observers who'd finally been pushed up to the front line. Standard procedure. Normal operations. Everything by the book. It felt strange after the morning's improvisation, like returning to a script after ad-libbing your way through opening night. James found himself second-guessing every calculation, double-checking bearings he would normally trust on instinct. The backward sighting technique had worked once, but it had also opened a door in his mind, a realization that the rules weren't as fixed as he'd believed. That realization was dangerous. By nightfall, they'd fired 37 more rounds, exhausting their ammunition supply. A runner brought fresh supplies at 1900 hours, along with something unexpected, a handwritten note from Captain Osborne requesting James report to the command. "Bunker at 2000 hours. What do you think he wants?" Eddie asked as they cleaned the mortar tube. "Probably to chew me out for using an unauthorized technique," James said, though he didn't really believe it. Leon shook his head. "He's putting you in for a medal." Dennison said so. "Medal doesn't matter," James replied. "We did what needed doing. That's it." But when he arrived at the command bunker, a reinforced German position that still smelled of enemy tobacco and sweat, he found more than just Captain Osborne waiting. Major William Brennan from battalion headquarters sat on an ammunition crate, smoking a cigarette and studying a map. Two other officers James didn't recognize stood in the corner, conferring in low voices. "Corporal Hutchins reporting as ordered, sir," James said, saluting. Osborne returned the salute. "At ease, Corporal. Major Brennan wanted to speak with you about this morning's fire mission." Brennan was a West Point graduate, the kind of officer who still managed to look crisp even after weeks in the forest. He stubbed out his cigarette and regarded James with intelligent, calculating eyes. "Corporal, I've read the after-action report. I've also spoken with Sergeant Bradley and several men from Company K. They're calling this morning's mortar support the most effective fire mission they've witnessed in 11 months of combat." Brennan paused. "Captain Osborne tells me you had no forward observer and no line of sight to the target. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir." "He also tells me you fired only 3 rounds and achieved what an entire artillery battalion failed to accomplish over 3 days. 2 direct hits and 1 near miss close enough to cause abandonment of the position." James shifted uncomfortably. "I got lucky, sir." "Lucky," Brennan repeated, his tone suggesting he didn't believe that for a second. "Captain Osborne says you used the church tower as a reference point and calculated a reciprocal bearing. Walk me through your process." For the next 20 minutes, James explained the technique, the geometry, the calculations, the adjustments based on sound. Brennan listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a small pad he pulled from his pocket. When James finished, Brennan leaned back. "That's not in any manual I've read. Where did you learn it?" "I didn't learn it, sir. I figured it out this morning when there wasn't any other option." One of the officers in the corner spoke up. A Captain James didn't know. "Major, with respect, this technique is completely unreliable. It depends on too many variables: memory of terrain, visibility of landmarks, precise calculation under combat stress. The fact that it worked once doesn't mean it's viable for general use." "I agree," another officer added. "We can't train soldiers on improvised methods. Doctrine exists for a reason. If every mortar crew started firing blind based on guesswork—" "It's not guesswork," James interrupted, then immediately regretted speaking out of turn. "Sorry, sir. I mean, it's not entirely guesswork. It's based on solid principles: geometry, ballistics, knowing your weapon's characteristics. The improvisation was just applying those principles in an unconventional way." Brennan studied him. "You're right to defend your method, Corporal. It saved lives, but the captain raises a valid point. What works for a skilled gunner with 6 months of combat experience might not work for a private fresh out of training." "I never said anyone else should try it, sir," James replied carefully. "It was a desperate measure for a desperate situation." "And if you find yourself in another desperate situation?" Brennan asked. "Would you try it again?" James considered that. The honest answer was yes. If 14 men were dying and he had no other option, he'd aim backward again and pray the math held. But saying that out loud felt like admitting that doctrine wasn't enough. That sometimes the manual failed and you had to write your own chapter. If I had no other choice, James said finally. Yes, sir. I would, Brennan nodded slowly. That's what I thought. He stood, approaching James. Corporal, I'm recommending you for a Bronze Star. Your actions this morning demonstrated exceptional skill and initiative. You're also being reassigned. James's stomach dropped. Reassigned, sir? To battalion headquarters. We need experienced mortar instructors to train replacement crews. You'll be pulled off the line next week. The words hit James like physical blows. Off the line? Away from Eddie and Leon. Away from the men he'd fought beside since Normandy. Away from the war that wasn't finished. Sir, with respect, I'd prefer to stay with my crew. I'm sure you would, Brennan said. But trained mortar crews are in short supply. We've lost too many good men. You can do more good training the next generation than you can firing a single tube on the front line. Major, my men need me. Your men will get a replacement, Brennan said, his tone firming. This isn't a discussion, Corporal. It's an order. You've done outstanding work here, but the Army's needs come first. Report to battalion headquarters on the 25th. That gives you a week to train your replacement and tie up loose ends. The meeting ended shortly after. James walked back to his position in a daze, barely aware of the cold or the darkness. When he arrived, Eddie and Leon were waiting, their faces expectant. So? Eddie asked. What did they want? I'm being reassigned, James said flatly. Battalion headquarters. Training duty. I leave in a week. The silence that followed was suffocating. Training duty? Leon finally said. They're pulling you off the line? They think I can do more good teaching others. James sat heavily on an ammunition crate. Brennan wants me to train replacement crews. Eddie's face darkened. That's bull. You belong here with us. We're a crew. You can't just... It's not my choice, James cut him off. Orders are orders, but even as he said it, James felt something hardening inside him. He'd saved 14 lives this morning using a technique no one had taught him, and his reward was being pulled away from the men who trusted him. The Army wanted to put him in a classroom, teaching doctrine to kids who'd be dead in 3 months, because doctrine didn't cover what happened when everything went wrong. The backward sighting technique had worked. It had saved lives. But now James understood the real lesson of the morning. The system didn't want innovation. It wanted conformity. It wanted soldiers who followed procedures, not soldiers who rewrote them when the situation demanded it. We've got a week, Leon said quietly. Let's make it count, James nodded. Yeah, let's make it count. But as he stared into the darkness beyond their position, listening to distant artillery and the occasional crackle of small arms fire, James made a decision. If they were pulling him off the line, he'd make damn sure his replacement understood something no manual could teach. Sometimes the only way forward was to aim backward and trust yourself when everyone... The third round detonated at 6:58 and 7 seconds, and the forest went silent. Not the temporary silence of shocked gun crews scrambling for cover. Not the brief pause of men catching their breath between bursts. This was complete, absolute silence, the kind that only comes when weapons stop firing because there's no one left to fire them. James stood motionless, barely breathing, listening to the absence of sound. The machine guns had stopped, all 3 of them. The ripping canvas noise that had dominated the morning was gone, replaced by wind moving through frozen trees and the distant rumble of artillery to the north. Did we? Leon started. Wait, James cut him off. Just wait. They waited. 10 seconds, 20, 30, no machine gun fire. No German voices shouting corrections. No sound of weapons being repositioned or reloaded. Then Captain Osborne's voice came over the radio, thick with emotion. Hutchins, I don't know what you just did, but every gun just went silent. Every single one. Eddie let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Leon dropped to his knees in the mud, head bowed, lips moving in silent prayer. James just stood there, staring in the direction of the ridge he couldn't see, trying to process what had just happened. 3 rounds. 90 seconds from first shot to last impact. 3 German machine gun positions silenced. It shouldn't have worked. Every manual, every doctrine, every principle of indirect fire said it was impossible. But impossible just meant no one had figured it out yet. Company K is moving, Osborne reported. Bradley's taking them across now. James could hear them through the trees. The sound of men rising from cover, the rustle of equipment, the quick commands to move fast and stay low. They were expecting fire. Every man crossing that clearing was braced for the machine guns to open up again, to cut them down mid-sprint. But the guns stayed silent. "First wave across," Osborne said at 700 hours exactly. "No contact, no fire. They're in the tree line on the far side." Eddie was grinning, tears streaming down his face. "We did it. Holy hell, James, we actually did it." But James wasn't celebrating. He was already moving, breaking down the mortar. "Carmichael, Weiss, pack it up. We need to displace, now." Leon looked up, confused. "What? Why?" The Germans saw our muzzle flash," James said curtly, working the bipod loose. "They'll have registered our position by now. Counter-battery fire is coming. We have maybe 5 minutes before they drop everything they've got on this exact spot." The celebration died instantly. Training took over. Eddie grabbed the base plate, grunting under its weight. Leon secured the tube. James hefted the bipod and they moved, 30 meters south to a new position behind a fallen tree that had been blown apart by artillery weeks ago. They dug in fast, setting up the mortar in a shallow depression that offered some protection. James checked his watch. 7:39. At 7:41, German artillery struck their old position. 6 rounds, probably from a 105mm howitzer, walking across the area where they'd been dug in just minutes before. The impacts were precise, methodical, devastating. Trees exploded into splinters. Earth fountained upward. The concussion waves rolled over their new position, making their ears ring. Someone on the German side had been watching. Someone had marked the exact spot where those mortar rounds originated, and someone had called in fire with professional efficiency. But James was no longer there. "That's why you don't stay put after you fire," James said quietly, watching smoke rise from their former position. "First rule of artillery, shoot and move." Eddie stared at the destruction. "If we'd stayed there." "We didn't," James said firmly. "That's all that matters." The radio crackled again. "Hutchins, this is Bradley. We're at the German positions now. You need to see this." "Can't leave our position, Sergeant," James replied. "We're set up for counter-battery if they try again. I'm sending someone back with a report then." "You're not going to believe this." While they waited, James took stock. 3 rounds expended. Mission accomplished. Crew intact. No casualties. By every measure, it had been a perfect fire mission. But perfect didn't feel the way he'd expected. It felt hollow, temporary, like a storm that had passed but would return. Private William Dennison arrived 20 minutes later, breathing hard from running through the forest. He was young, maybe 19, with dirt on his face and blood on his uniform that James hoped wasn't his own. "Corporal Hutchins?" Dennison asked. "That's me. Sergeant Bradley sent me to tell you about the German positions." Dennison's voice carried a mix of awe and horror. 2 of the 3 gun nests were direct hits, dead center. The crews. They didn't have a chance. Equipment's destroyed. 1 MG-42 is bent at an angle that shouldn't be possible. 4 bodies visible, probably more buried. James nodded slowly, his face expressionless. "And the 3rd position?" "Abandoned. Your 2nd round landed within 10 meters of their foxhole. Close enough that they fled. Left everything, the gun, ammunition, personal equipment, rations. Bradley found a canteen of coffee still warm. Anyone from Company K hurt in the crossing?" "Not a single casualty once the guns stopped. Raymond Kowalski is wounded but alive. Medics think he'll make it." Dennison paused. "Sergeant Bradley wanted me to tell you something else. He said to tell you that you just saved 14 lives with 3 shots. He said you did something he's never seen in 3 years of combat." James didn't respond. He just stared at the forest, processing. "He also said Captain Osborne is recommending you for a commendation," Dennison continued, "for actions under fire." "I was just doing my job," James said quietly. "Sir, with respect. What you did wasn't in any job description I've ever seen." Dennison looked at him with something close to reverence. "How did you aim without being able to see the target?" James glanced at Eddie and Leon. They'd earned the right to know, but somehow explaining it felt impossible. "How do you put into words what had happened? How do you describe aiming backward, trusting geometry, gambling on memory?" "I used the church tower as a reference point," James said finally. calculated a reciprocal bearing. The Germans were on the opposite side of a straight line running through my position. Dennison blinked. I've never heard of anyone doing that. Neither have I, James admitted. But it worked. After Dennison left, the three of them sat in silence. The adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. James's hands were shaking now. Delayed reaction, the price you paid for staying calm under pressure. You know what scares me? Leon said quietly. What if it hadn't worked? What if your memory was wrong, or your calculations were off by just a few degrees? Those rounds could have landed on Company K, on our own men. I know, James said, but you did it anyway. I had to. They were dying. Eddie leaned back against the fallen tree. Are you going to write this down? The technique? So other mortar crews know how to do it? James considered that. I don't think so. It's not something you can teach from a manual. It depends on too many variables. Terrain, memory, landmarks, knowing your weapon well enough to improvise. What worked here might not work anywhere else, but it did work, Leon pressed. You proved it's possible. I proved it's possible once, under specific conditions, when there was no other choice. James met his eyes. That's not the same as proving it's reliable. The radio crackled. Captain Osborne's voice. All positions be advised. German counterattack expected within the hour. Dig in and prepare for contact. James looked at his crew. You heard the man. War's not over just because we had one good morning. But as they prepared their position, reinforcing it with logs and frozen earth, James couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. He'd done something that shouldn't have been possible. And now he'd have to live with the knowledge that when Doctrine failed, when every rule said it couldn't be done, sometimes you just had to aim backward and trust yourself. 14 men were alive. Part 3. The first shot Eddie. Weiss dropped the round into the tube. The mortar erupted with a flat, brutal crack that James felt in his chest cavity. The base plate drove 6 inches into frozen earth. The bipod legs shuddered violently. A gout of flame burst from the muzzle, briefly illuminating the dark canopy overhead. And then the projectile vanished into gray sky. Silence followed. The terrible, stretching silence of consequence. James didn't move. He stood frozen, staring upward at nothing, his breath coming in shallow clouds. Beside him, Eddie crouched by the remaining ammunition, 2 rounds laid carefully on a canvas tarp. Leon knelt at the bipod, his hand still on the traversing knob, waiting for orders that James couldn't give yet. 51 seconds. That's how long the round would take to reach its apex, arc over, and fall. 51 seconds felt like 51 years. James counted in his head, the way he'd been trained. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. The German machine guns continued their work, that horrible ripping sound echoing through the forest. Somewhere in that clearing, men were pressed into frozen mud, faces down, waiting to live or die based on calculations made by a corporal from Michigan who was guessing. 10 Mississippi. 11 Mississippi. Come on, Eddie whispered. Come on, 20 Mississippi. 21 Mississippi. James's mind raced through the variables again. Had he calculated the deflection correctly? Was his memory of the German positions accurate? 3 days was a lifetime in combat. The Germans could have moved, repositioned, changed their entire defensive setup. The church tower bearing might be off by a degree or two. A single degree at this range meant a miss of 15 meters. 30 meters. Enough to waste a round they couldn't afford to waste. 35 Mississippi. 36 Mississippi. Leon's lips were moving. Prayer or calculation, James couldn't tell. Maybe both. The kid had steady hands. The kind of precision that came from years of delicate work. But this wasn't about steady hands anymore. This was about faith in mathematics, in memory, in the idea that sometimes the impossible was just the improbable wearing a different face. 45 Mississippi. 46 Mississippi. James's father used to say that measurement was the difference between success and catastrophic failure. A quarter-inch error in cutting lumber could collapse a whole structure. James had learned that lesson young, had carried it into the army, had applied it to mortar fire. But those lessons assumed you could measure, could verify, could see the thing you were trying to hit. 49 Mississippi. 50 Mississippi. 51. The impact came as a distant crump, muffled by trees and terrain, felt as much as heard. A dull thud that rolled through the forest like distant thunder. James's heart stopped. The sound had come from the right direction, from somewhere beyond the ridge, from enemy territory. But close wasn't good enough. Close didn't silence machine guns. Then he heard it. German voices, high-pitched and panicked, shouting in their harsh, clipped language. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear, surprise, confusion. And for 5 seconds, 5 beautiful, impossible seconds, the machine guns went silent. All 3 of them. Then 2 resumed firing. 1 did not. James exhaled, a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "We hit something." "1 gun down," Leon said, his voice shaking. 2 still firing. Not for long. James was already moving, his mind processing the first impact, comparing it to what he'd expected. The sound had been slightly right of where he'd aimed, maybe 10 meters. The elevation was close. The round had landed on the reverse slope, not over it or short of it. Close. So damn close. But close wasn't done. Company K was still pinned. 2 machine guns were still firing. And James had 2 rounds left. "Adjustment," he said, his voice sharp with focus. He made a quick calculation, fingers working the traversing mechanism. 16 mils, right? Drop elevation by 25 mils. The correction was pure instinct, based on nothing but the sound of the first impact and 6 months of experience that had become muscle memory. Eddie already had the second round ready. "Standing by, fire," James ordered. The tube cracked again. Base plate drove deeper. The bipod shifted slightly in the mud, a tiny movement that could throw off everything. James made a mental note to recheck deflection after this shot if there was time for a third. The round climbed into gray sky. 48 seconds at this trajectory. James counted again, but this time he was listening differently. The first shot had told him something, told him his memory was good, his calculations were close, his understanding of the weapon was sound. The second shot would tell him if he could adjust, if he could correct, if he could turn close into direct. The German voices were still shouting. One of the machine guns had resumed firing, but the rate was different. Shorter bursts, more cautious. They knew something was hunting them. They knew death was falling from above. They just didn't know where the next round would land. Neither did James. 30 seconds. 35. Captain Osborne's voice crackled over the radio. "Hutchins, first impact was close. Real close. 1 gun stopped firing. Can you—" "Working on it, sir." James cut him off. "Stay quiet. I need to hear." 45 seconds. 46. The impact came sharper this time, closer, the sound cutting through the forest with authority. And this time, the effect was immediate. 2 of the 3 German machine. Guns went silent, just stopped, mid-burst, as if someone had flipped a switch, and gun continued firing, the same gun that had kept going after the first round. But its fire was erratic now, undisciplined, the kind of wild shooting that came from panic rather than training. 2 down, Eddie breathed. Holy Mary, Mother of God, 2 down. Leon was staring at James like he'd just performed a miracle. "How did you—" "Check the bipod," James interrupted. "Did it shift?" Leon examined the mounting. 3 mils left. "The second shot moved us," James cursed under his breath. 3 mils wasn't much, but it was enough to throw off the third shot if he didn't compensate. He made the correction, adding 3 mils right to bring the deflection back to the original bearing. The remaining German gun was still firing. But now James could hear something else, American voices, cautious but hopeful. "Is that it? Are they done?" "1 gun still active," Sergeant Thomas Bradley's voice came over the radio. "Northeast position. Still has us locked down. 1 gun. 1 gun was enough to stop an advance, enough to kill anyone who tried to cross that clearing. But 1 gun was better than 3. 1 gun meant James had done something right. He picked up the third round himself, feeling its weight, its terrible potential. This was it. Last chance. No more adjustments, no more learning, no more guessing. This round either finished the job or Company K stayed, pinned until artillery arrived, if it arrived, or until the Germans brought in their own. Mortars and walked fire across the American positions. Same bearing, James said quietly. Same elevation. No further adjustment. You sure? Leon asked. James looked at him. No. But it's what we've got. He positioned himself over the tube, holding the round steady. His hands were rock steady now, the trembling gone. This was the moment where training and instinct merged, where calculation gave way to certainty. He knew this weapon. He knew what it could do. He knew what he could do. For Kowalski, Eddie said softly. For all of them, James replied. He dropped the round at 6:57 exactly. The tube fired. The base plate sank deeper. The bipod held. The projectile climbed toward its apex, carrying with it the last hope of 14 men who'd never know the name of the corporal who was trying to save them. The week that followed felt like watching sand slip through an hourglass. Inevitable, irreversible, and far too fast. James threw himself into training his replacement with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The new gunner was a corporal named Douglas Harper, transferred from a heavy mortar unit that had been decimated near Aachen. Harper was competent, experienced, and by the book in every way that made James uneasy. On the second day, James tried to explain the reciprocal bearing technique. Let me get this straight, Harper said, squinting at the church tower in the distance. You aimed at a landmark behind you, calculated the opposite direction, and fired blind at targets you couldn't see. That's the basic idea, James confirmed. Harper shook his head. That's not doctrine, Corporal. That's suicide. If I tried that and dropped rounds on friendly positions, they'd court-martial me. It worked, James insisted. It saved 14 men. It worked once, under specific conditions when you got lucky. Harper's tone wasn't hostile, just matter of fact. I'm not saying you did wrong. You had no choice. But that's not something I'd ever attempt. Too many variables. Too much risk, James wanted to argue, to make Harper understand that sometimes risk was all you had. But he saw it in the other man's eyes, that fundamental difference between someone who followed orders and someone who questioned them when lives were at stake. Harper would never aim backward. He'd wait for proper forward observers, proper communication, proper procedure, and men would die while he waited. That night, James sat with Eddie and Leon in their position, sharing a canteen of terrible coffee and watching their breath form clouds in the frozen air. Harper's not going to cut it, Eddie said bluntly. He's too rigid. First time things go sideways, he'll freeze up. He's what we've got, James replied. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe rigid is safer. Maybe what I did was reckless and we just got lucky. Leon looked at him sharply. You don't believe that. I don't know what I believe anymore. James stared at the mortar tube, the weapon he'd known better than anything else in his life. The Major's right about one thing. That technique isn't teachable. It's not reliable. It worked because of terrain, timing, experience, and pure desperation. Those conditions might never exist again. But they might, Eddie pressed. And when they do, crews need to know it's possible. How do I teach possibility? James asked. How do I write a manual that says break every rule, trust your gut, and pray? The Army doesn't work that way. The conversation died there, but the question lingered. On the fourth day, the Germans retook Kleinhau sector. A counterattack by elements of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, reinforced by assault guns, pushed Company K back across the same clearing they'd fought so hard to cross. James watched from his position as American forces retreated under heavy fire, giving up ground that had cost blood and lives. The ridge was lost. The machine gun positions were reoccupied. Different unit, fresh crews, same strategic nightmare. They're setting up in the exact same spots, Leon observed through binoculars. Same positions we hit last week. James felt something twist in his chest. All that work, all that risk, all those calculations, rendered meaningless by the simple fact that ground changed hands and the war ground forward. Sergeant Bradley found him that evening. Limping from a shrapnel wound he refused to let medics evacuate him for. Hutchins, Bradley said, sitting heavily beside him. Heard you're leaving us. Orders, James said simply. Yeah, well, orders are keeping you alive. The rest of us aren't so lucky. Bradley pulled out a battered photograph, his wife and 2 daughters back in Oregon. I wanted to say thanks for what you did. Kowalski's alive because of you. So am I. So are 12 other men who'd be dead if you hadn't figured out that crazy trick. It wasn't a trick, James said quietly. It was geometry. Whatever it was, it worked. Bradley tucked the photograph away. You know what kills me? We'll probably have to take that ridge again next month. Different crew, same position. And whoever's running mortars then won't know what you know. They'll do it by the book, call for artillery that won't come, and watch men die while they wait for proper procedure. The words hung between them like an accusation. What am I supposed to do? James asked. The technique only worked because of specific conditions. I can't teach it. Hell, I'm not even sure I could replicate it. Maybe you can't teach the technique, Bradley said, standing. But you can teach the thinking behind it. That when the manual fails, you don't just give up and watch men die. You find another way. After Bradley left, James pulled out his field notebook, a small, battered thing he'd carried since Normandy. He'd kept notes on weather conditions, trajectory calculations, propellant performance in different temperatures. Now he opened to a blank page and started writing. Not a manual. Not a procedure. Just observations. When indirect fire without observation becomes necessary, when the situation is desperate and lives depend on immediate action, consider the following. A landmark visible from firing position can establish a baseline bearing. The reciprocal bearing, opposite direction, 180 degrees, can be calculated if the relationship between landmark and target is known. High-angle fire, 80+ degrees elevation, can strike reverse slope targets without line of sight. Adjustments must be made for... He wrote for 2 hours, trying to capture not just what he'd done, but why it had worked. The underlying principles, the mathematical foundation, the factors that had made success possible. When he finished, he stared at the pages and realized something sobering. He'd just written instructions for a technique that could save lives or end them. In the right hands, with the right judgment, it was a tool. In the wrong hands, it was a disaster waiting to happen. He almost tore the pages out. Instead, he folded them carefully and tucked them into his jacket pocket. On the 6th day, January 23rd, German artillery began hammering American positions in preparation for another counterattack. James, Eddie, and Leon worked their mortar continuously for 8 hours, firing counter-battery missions, suppressing German assembly areas, dropping rounds on coordinates called in by observers who were dying as fast as the army could replace them. It was brutal, mechanical, exhausting work, the kind of combat that ground men down into automatons who loaded, fired and moved without thinking, and through it all, James kept thinking about those notes in his pocket. About whether knowledge was worth preserving if it was dangerous. About whether he had the right to withhold information that might save lives, even if it might also cost them. That night, he showed the notes to Eddie and Leon. They read in silence, their faces illuminated by a small shielded lamp. "This is good," Eddie said finally. "This explains it. Someone reading this could understand how you did it." "That's what I'm afraid of," James admitted. "What if someone tries it without the experience to back it up? What if they kill friendly troops? What if they save 14 men?" Leon countered. "What if someday, somewhere, another crew is in the exact same situation we were in, and these notes give them a chance they wouldn't have had?" James took the notes back, staring at his own handwriting. "I don't know if I should give this to Brennan. He might file it away. He might ban it entirely. Or he might try to make it standard procedure, and then it becomes something crews attempt when they shouldn't. Or, Eddie said quietly, you keep it. Hold on to it, and if you ever meet another mortar crew that needs it, really needs it, you give it to them then." James nodded slowly. That felt right. Not doctrine, not procedure, just knowledge, preserved and shared when the moment demanded it. On the 7th day, January 25th, James packed his gear. Harper took over the mortar position. Eddie and Leon shook his hand with grips that lasted too long and said too little. "Stay alive," James told them. "You too," Eddie replied. "And hey, if training gets boring, just remember you once aimed a mortar backward and saved 14 lives. That's got to count for something," James managed to smile. "Yeah, it counts." As he walked away from the position he'd occupied for months, James touched the folded notes in his pocket. He didn't know if he'd made the right choice. He didn't know if preserving that knowledge was wisdom or recklessness, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. When the manual failed and men were dying, someone had to be willing to aim backward and trust themselves. That was the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. James Hutchins survived. Eddie Carmichael survived. Leon Weiss did not. He died on February 11th during the final push for the Hürtgen Forest, killed by a German sniper while moving to a new firing position. The bullet caught him in the neck, quick, clinical, final. Eddie wrote James a letter 3 days later. The words were simple, brutal. Leon's gone. Thought you should know. He talked about you until the end. Said you taught him that sometimes the impossible was just the improbable wearing a different face. James received the letter at Officer Candidate School in the States. He'd been pulled from the European theater in March, processed through the system, and deposited into a classroom where instructors taught leadership principles and tactical doctrine to men who'd never heard incoming artillery. He read Eddie's letter alone in his barracks and felt something fundamental break inside. Leon had been 19 years old. A jeweler's son from Brooklyn who'd brought precision and care to everything he touched. He'd survived Normandy, survived the Hürtgen, survived long enough to see that the technique worked, and then died anyway. Because war didn't care about competence or courage or how many impossible things you'd accomplished. James requested permission to attend the funeral. Permission denied. Training schedule was inflexible. He graduated Officer Candidate School as a second lieutenant in June 1945, 2 months after Germany surrendered. The Army offered him a regular commission. He declined, mustered out in October with the rank of sergeant and a Bronze Star that felt heavier than metal should. He returned to Flint, Michigan. He married Sarah Peterson in 1947, a nurse he'd met at a veterans hospital where he'd gone for treatment of what they politely called nervous exhaustion. They had 3 children, Robert, Patricia, and Michael. James worked 31 years for General Motors at the Buick assembly plant, assembling cars with the same methodical precision he'd once used to calculate mortar trajectories. He never told his children about the war. Not really. When they asked, he'd say he'd served in Germany, done his duty, come home. The Bronze Star sat in a drawer wrapped in tissue paper. Sarah knew better than to ask about it. But James never forgot. He kept his field notebook in the garage workshop, hidden behind paint cans and tools. Sometimes, late at night, when insomnia claimed him, he'd pull it out and read his own notes about reciprocal bearings and high-angle fire. He'd trace the calculations, remember the frozen forest, hear the sound of machine guns going silent, and he'd wonder if anyone else had ever needed what he'd figured out that morning. He got his answer in 1953. A letter arrived from the Department of the Army, forwarded through 3 addresses before finding him. It was from a Marine Corps officer named William Marsh, writing on behalf of his platoon. The letter was formal, but the emotion beneath it was raw. Mr. Hutchins, I recently completed a military history course that referenced mortar operations during World War II. Your name appeared in a footnote about improvised fire techniques during the Hürtgen Forest campaign. I want you to know that in November 1950, near the Chosin Reservoir in Korea, I found myself in a nearly identical situation. Chinese troops attacking from one direction, my platoon pinned, no forward observer, no line of sight. I remembered reading about your technique. I used a hilltop behind my position to calculate a reciprocal bearing. I dropped rounds on Chinese positions I couldn't see. It worked. 37 men in my platoon survived because you figured out something no manual ever taught. I wanted you to know that your innovation didn't die in the Hürtgen Forest. It saved lives again, on the other side of the world, in a different war. James read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. Sarah found him at the kitchen table, tears streaming down his face. What is it? She asked, alarmed. Someone used it, James whispered. In Korea, the technique. It worked again. He wrote back to Marsh immediately, asking for details. They corresponded for months. Marsh had been recommended for a Navy Cross. The citation didn't mention the method, just as James's Bronze Star citation hadn't. The technique remained invisible, passed along through footnotes and remembered stories and desperate moments when conventional wisdom failed. Years passed. James retired from General Motors in 1978. His children grew up, had children of their own. He aged into a quiet man who tended his garden and attended church and rarely spoke of the past. Then came 1983. Robert, his oldest son, brought home a young man named David Chen, a West Point graduate heading to his first posting. Over dinner, the conversation turned to military history. David mentioned he'd written his senior thesis on improvised mortar tactics. "There's this fascinating case from World War II," David said enthusiastically. "A corporal in the Hurtgen forest who figured out how to hit targets without line of sight. He used landmarks and reverse bearings. Nobody knew how he did it until decades later when they interviewed veterans. The Army never officially documented the technique, but it keeps getting rediscovered. Korea, Vietnam. There are at least 4 confirmed cases of mortar crews independently figuring out the same principle." James set down his fork. "Vietnam? April 1968, David confirmed. A crew supporting a long-range patrol in the A Shau Valley. The gunner aimed at a mountain peak behind him and dropped rounds over a ridge onto enemy positions. Saved the patrol. Got a silver star," David paused. "The crazy thing is, none of these cases reference each other. Each time it's like someone reinvents the wheel because the knowledge never gets formally preserved. Why not?" James asked quietly. "Because it's not doctrine. It can't be taught from a manual. It depends on judgment, terrain, experience, things that don't translate to classroom instruction. The Army prefers methods that work reliably for average soldiers. This technique only works for exceptional soldiers in desperate circumstances." After dinner, James took David to his workshop. He pulled out the old field notebook, open to the pages he'd written 40 years earlier. "I was that corporal," James said. "January 18th, 1945. Kleinhau sector. 3 rounds, 90 seconds, 14 men saved." David stared at the notebook like it was a holy relic. "This is, Mr. Hutchins, this is primary source documentation of the original technique. Do you have any idea how valuable this is?" "I know exactly how valuable it is," James replied. "I also know how dangerous it is. In 1945, another crew tried to copy what I did. They killed 3 American soldiers. Friendly fire because they didn't understand when the technique should never be attempted." He closed the notebook. "That's why I never published it. That's why I kept it hidden. Knowledge without wisdom is just a loaded weapon handed to a child. I taught it once, to replacement crews at battalion headquarters. I made sure they understood the danger, the limitations, the judgment required. But I've never been certain that was the right choice." David was quiet for a long moment. "What about Sergeant Marsh in Korea? What about the crew in Vietnam? If you hadn't figured it out, if the knowledge hadn't survived somehow, those men would have had one less option when they needed it most. Or they might have made catastrophic mistakes trying something they didn't fully understand." "But they didn't," David pressed gently. "Every documented case worked. Every time someone rediscovered the technique, they used it successfully. Maybe that's because the kind of soldier who figures it out independently is also the kind of soldier with the judgment to use it correctly." James had never considered that. Maybe the technique selected for itself, only getting rediscovered by people desperate enough and skilled enough to make it work. Maybe attempting to teach it was the mistake, and letting it remain hidden knowledge was the wisdom. "What would you do with this?" James asked, gesturing to the notebook. "With your permission, I'd like to document it, not as a training manual, as a historical case study about innovation under pressure, about what happens when doctrine fails and soldiers have to improvise. It would be part of military history, preserved but not prescribed." James thought about Leon Weiss, dead at 19. About Eddie Carmichael, who'd survived the war but drank himself to death by 1962. About Raymond Kowalski and Thomas Bradley and William Dennison and all the men who'd crossed that clearing because 3 mortar rounds had silenced the guns. "On one condition," James said. "You include the failure, the 3 men killed by friendly fire. You make it clear that this isn't a miracle technique. It's a desperate measure that worked under specific conditions and killed men when those conditions weren't met. You preserve both the success and the danger." David agreed. The case study was published in 1984 in a military journal that few people read. It documented James's technique, Marsh's use of it in Korea, the Vietnam case, and the friendly fire incident. It concluded that the reciprocal bearing method represented a rare instance of tactical innovation emerging from battlefield necessity, characterized by both exceptional utility and exceptional risk. James Hutchins died 5 years later, in 1989, of heart failure at the age of 68. His obituary in the Flint Journal mentioned that the Reckoning Battalion headquarters was located 3 kilometers behind the front line in what had once been a German supply depot. The building was scarred by artillery, missing half its roof, but it had walls thick enough to stop shrapnel and a basement deep enough to survive most bombardments. James reported at 0900 hours on January 26th, his gear still muddy from the front, his mind still back there with Eddie and Leon. Major Brennan met him in what passed for an office, a corner of the main room partitioned off with salvaged lumber and canvas. A field desk held stacks of reports, maps weighted down with ammunition clips, and a photograph of a woman James assumed was Brennan's wife. "Corporal Hutchins," Brennan said, not looking up from the report he was reading. "You're early. Good. We have 17 replacement crews arriving next week. Most of them have 12 weeks of stateside training and 0 combat experience. Your job is to keep them alive long enough to learn what 12 weeks at Fort Benning doesn't teach." "Yes, sir." Brennan finally looked up. "I've been thinking about your technique. The reciprocal bearing method. I want you to include it in your instruction." James felt his chest tighten. "Sir, with respect, I'm not sure that's wise. The technique worked once under very specific conditions. Making it standard procedure could—" "I'm not making it standard procedure," Brennan interrupted. "I'm making it available knowledge. There's a difference. These men need to understand that when everything goes to hell, when the radios are dead and the observers are gone and their options are reduced to nothing, they still have one more card to play." He paused. "But they also need to understand when not to play it. That's where you come in. Sir, I don't know how to teach judgment, then teach consequences." Brennan stood, moving to a map of the Hurtgen Forest pinned to the wall. 4 days ago, 2nd Battalion 89th Infantry had a mortar crew in a situation similar to yours. Pin company, no forward observer, desperate conditions. The gunner tried to improvise, aimed at a distant hilltop, calculated what he thought was a reciprocal bearing, fired 3 rounds. James felt ice forming in his stomach. What happened? 2 rounds landed in German territory, ineffective. The 3rd landed on a platoon from his own battalion. Killed 3 men, wounded 7 more. Brennan turned to face him. The gunner was a competent soldier. He'd heard about what you did. He thought he could replicate it. He was wrong. The room felt suddenly airless. James saw those 3 men in his mind. American soldiers killed by their own mortars, dying because someone had tried to copy a technique they didn't fully understand. "Sir, that's exactly why I shouldn't teach this. It's too dangerous in the wrong hands, and too valuable to suppress in the right ones," Brennan countered. "That gunner failed because he didn't understand the limitations. He didn't grasp the variables. He knew what you did, but not why it worked or when it should never be attempted." Brennan leaned against his desk. "Your job is to teach both. The possibility and the danger, the technique and the judgment." James pulled the folded notes from his pocket, setting them on the desk. "I wrote this down. Everything I could remember about the process, the calculations, the factors that made it work. But I'm not sure it's enough." Brennan unfolded the pages, reading carefully. When he finished, he looked at James with something like respect. "This is good work, Corporal, thorough, but you're right. It's not enough. Knowledge without wisdom is just a loaded weapon handed to a child. So what do you want me to do?" "Teach them the technique, but also teach them the story. Make them understand what you were facing, why conventional methods had failed, how you calculated risk versus reward. Make them understand that this isn't a tool for convenience. It's a last resort when the alternative is watching men die." Brennan picked up a file from his desk, opening it. I've been reviewing after-action reports from across the division. In the last month alone, we've had 8 situations where mortar crews couldn't engage targets due to lack of forward observers or line of sight. 8 times when crews sat idle while infantry got cut to pieces. Not because they lacked skill or courage, but because they lacked options. He pulled out several reports, spreading them across the desk. Here, December 15th near Vasenek. Company A pinned by machine guns on reverse slope. Mortar crew available, no forward observer. Crew waited for artillery support. Artillery came 4 hours later. 17 casualties in the interim. Another report. January 7th near Germata. Platoon trapped in valley, German positions on ridge above. Mortar crew had line of sight to landmark behind target. Crew commander considered improvised fire. Decided against it per doctrine. Platoon stayed pinned for 6 hours until reinforcements arrived. 11 casualties. Report after report. Each one a story of men who'd followed the rules, done everything by the book, and watched soldiers die because the book didn't cover every situation. These crews weren't incompetent, Brennan said quietly. They were following doctrine. And doctrine got men killed. He looked at James. What you did wasn't doctrine. It was innovation born from desperation, and the army needs more of that, not less. James stared at the reports, feeling the weight of each casualty number. The gunner from 2nd Battalion 89th? What happened to him? Court-martialed. Reduced in rank. Reassigned to a rifle company. Brennan's voice was flat. He'll probably be dead within a month. The infantry in this forest doesn't have a long life expectancy. That's not fair. He was trying to save lives. He was trying to replicate a technique he didn't understand. There's a difference between innovation and imitation. Brennan met James's eyes. That's why I need you to teach this right. Not as a miracle solution. Not as a standard procedure, but as an option of absolute last resort that requires perfect conditions and exceptional judgment. Over the next 2 days, James developed his curriculum. He started with fundamentals, ballistics, trajectory calculation, wind estimation, temperature effects on propellant. Then he moved to conventional indirect fire procedures, drilling the replacement crews on standard observer-corrected fire missions until they could execute them in their sleep. Only then did he introduce the reciprocal bearing technique. He taught it in a tent with 23 mortar crews, 69, men who would be at the front within a week. He walked them through the geometry, the calculations, the environmental factors. He showed them his notes, explained his thinking, demonstrated how he'd used the church tower as a reference point. Then he told them about the 3 American soldiers killed by friendly fire. That gunner heard about what I did, James said, his voice carrying across the silent tent. He thought he understood it. He thought he could do the same thing. But he didn't account for terrain masking. He didn't verify his landmark was on the exact reciprocal bearing. He didn't consider dispersion patterns at high angle, and 3 men died because of it. He let that sink in. This technique is not a shortcut. It's not a replacement for proper procedure. It's an emergency measure that requires perfect conditions, a visible landmark on a known bearing, confirmed target location from prior observation, desperate circumstances where conventional methods have failed, and the judgment to recognize when the risk of action is less than the risk of inaction. A corporal in the front row raised his hand. How do we know when it's worth trying? That's the question that keeps me up at night, James admitted. Because there's no formula for judgment. But I can tell you this, if you have any other option, artillery, air support, conventional indirect fire with observers, use it. This technique only gets considered when every other option is gone and men are actively dying. Another hand. What if we're not sure about the bearing? What if our memory of the target location isn't perfect? Then you don't fire, James said firmly. Uncertainty means friendly casualties. If you're not absolutely certain, and I mean certain enough to stake your life on it, you don't take the shot. He spent 3 more hours going through scenarios, teaching them to recognize the difference between a situation where the technique might work and situations where it would fail catastrophically. He made them calculate trajectories, made them explain their reasoning, made them argue both for and against attempting it in various circumstances. By the end, most of them looked overwhelmed. "Sir," one private asked quietly, "has anyone else tried this technique successfully?" "Besides you," James hesitated. He didn't know about Korea or Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan. Those wars were decades in the future. But he suspected that somewhere, sometime, another desperate gunner had figured out the same principle. Innovation happened at the edges, when conditions forced it. I don't know, James answered honestly. But I know this. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you need it, where it's truly the last option, and men will die without it, you'll recognize the moment. And you'll either have the knowledge to try or you won't. That night, Major Brennan called him back to the office. I observed your instruction today, Brennan said. You did well. Balance the information with appropriate caution. Thank you, sir. I'm extending your assignment here. 3 more weeks. We have additional replacement crews arriving, and I want them to receive the same instruction.